Where do you come from? Another galaxy. Once a dead man, always a dead
Hello detectives, and welcome to the Ashveil post-release. I've been having an absolute blast playing Ashveil. He might not be one of the strongest top meta units, but I think he's been underestimated by the community, mostly in terms of his extremely high flexibility. Like, this guy is a greedy little man, and I've tested over 55 different teams with him, where he worked as a main DPS, a sub DPS, a support, etc. And in this video, I'm going to go over all of the notable units that worked well with him. I'm going to give my thoughts and a few tips and tricks just to help you to make the most out of his teammates. Honestly, this video is quite long and quite information dense, so I encourage you to look at the timestamps and jump around to the information that's relevant to you. And without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing you notice when you pick up and play Ashveil is that he's squishy as hell. This guy is made out of paper and glass. This is mostly down to his very low base HP and defense. And it may seem like a small thing, but it really does change how you play him and who you can play him with. It's kind of a shame because he's really good in Sustainless teams, but it's quite rough playing him in Sustainless. And if you're already not a fan of resetting your runs, then Ashveil's squishiness is really going to cause you some issues. And this particular survivability issue will only get worse over time because enemies are dealing more and more damage. And as your Ashveil builds get better, you end up having more crit and attack substats and less HP and defense substats in an optimal build, which means that the higher quality your build is, the squishier your Ashveil becomes. But in exchange for his low defensive stats, he's been given the highest base attack in the whole game, and his light cone has the highest base attack in the game. And both of these things really inform his team building process. So let's talk about teams. And I think he's really interesting when it comes to teams because he actually has 3 playstyles. He has a main DPS playstyle, which is probably the one that you've seen and heard about the most, where you use supports to buff his damage as much as possible. A sub DPS playstyle, where you enable a carry while also dealing your own damage. And my favourite, his supportive playstyle, where his primary function is just buffing the team. So what is Ashveil's actual best archetype? Is it as a support, a sub DPS, or a main DPS? And as always, it depends. It mostly depends on the level of investment of the units on your account. So if you have high investment on your supports, such as E1 Tribbie or E2 DHPT, his main DPS playstyle is most likely to be the best. Whereas if you have investment on your sub DPS, like an E2 Fei Xiao or an E2 Acheron, his sub DPS playstyle will shine. And if you have investment on Ashveil himself with his E1 and S1, then his supportive capabilities become a lot better. Let's talk about his main DPS playstyle first. I think most of you are probably most interested in this if you're pulling for him. So one thing I just love about Ashveil is that he's extremely flexible when it comes to picking supports for his main DPS team. And this is mostly because he already provides himself with a lot of crit damage and a lot of damage bonus in his kit. And usually the best supports in a hypercarry playstyle are Sunday and Sparkle, which give a lot of damage bonus and crit damage respectively. But since Ashveil is already saturated in these stats, it makes them a little bit less valuable. Whereas some of the more off-meta supports that provide stuff like attack percent and defensive shred become a lot more valuable when you play them with Ashveil. This means that the gap between the top meta supports and the less popular off-meta supports is a lot smaller than it seems. So there's a huge variety of options that you can choose that will result in similar performance. So I'm just going to highlight some of my favourite supports that I used in these teams. So first of all, we have Sunday, and I genuinely love Sunday with Ashveil. He's probably the most comfortable support that you can run with Ashveil for multiple reasons. First of all, the energy generation that he gives you is amazing. It really helps smooth out Ashveil's gameplay. The energy allows you to generate a lot more charges, which gives you a lot more uptime on his follow-up attacks. Another thing is, Sunday allows you to change targets a lot more easily. Sometimes you use your skill and you don't really want the follow-up attacks to land on that target, but because you're too slow, there isn't much you can do about it. But when you're playing Sunday, you can much more easily switch targets between your turns. Another thing that makes Sunday really shine is actually his synergy with DHPT. Not just the damage bonus, but the fact that he brings up the dragon as well, so you can consistently sustain your Ashveil and also ensure that your enhanced soul dragon goes right after Ashveil's turn. And the last thing that really elevates Sunday to my favorite Ashveil main DPS support is if you're running Sunday and DHPT, you can literally run any buffer or debuffer that you have on your account in the 4th slot and have good results. Like, I played Sunday Tribbie, Sunday Sparkle, and even teams like Sunday Pela and Sunday Black Swan. So as long as you're running DHPT as your support, Sunday is an amazing option. So next up is Sparkle, and Sparkle's a really interesting one because she is the damage per screenshot character. As in, out of all of the clears that I did, my highest recorded damage came from Sparkle teams. So in terms of just buffing capabilities, she provides some of the highest quality buffs in the game. The issue is some of the utility is lacking. All she really adds is 50% action advance and some extra skill points that we don't really get to use. But it's alright because your teammates can make up for that lack of utility. So there's 3 specific teams Sparkle teams that I want to talk about for 3 completely different reasons. The first one is Sparkle and RMC. This one just because it's a really good solid team, and some of you might have gotten Sparkle for free in the most recent patch. So I just wanted to mention this team as the best free to play plus team. RMC's action advance and attack frequency actually make up for the lack of utility that Sparkle has. And the fact that this team is technically all free, I think it was worth a mention. So the second team that I want to talk about is a really weird one, so bear with me for a second. But Sparkle with Black Swan. Sparkle with Black Swan is a notable team just because out of all of the teams that I tested, this team had the highest damage per screenshot numbers. And I can't lie, I do think it's funny that the 2 banner characters from 2.0 with completely different archetypes form a pretty decent team. I think the community still really underrates Black Swan as just a generic debuffer, because after her buffs, she just provides a lot of stats just from existing and from attacking enemies. She's literally Ruame but better now. I also got similar results by running Hysilens instead of Black Swan. The damage was a little bit lower. Hysilens buffs don't need you to attack or to use your ultimate, they just come from the zone. And honestly, I've been yapping about Sparkle for too long now, but the last Sparkle team that I wanted to talk about is the Sparkle Sunday team, the double action advance team, which is actually surprisingly good, but with a decent amount of quality of life issues. So obviously the first one is you need someone who can attack the enemies to trigger your follow-up attacks. And that burden is down to DHPT, so he's gonna have to be a lot faster and built with energy regen to be able to run this team. Another quality of life issue that I encountered is that a lot of Boothill, goddamn, Ashveil's a lot of Ashveil's damage comes from out of turn damage because of his follow-up attack. And what ends up happening is that one of your buffs ends up running out a bit too quickly because the action advance eats up the duration. So if you do Sparkle before Sunday, after you get advanced by Sunday and your second turn is over, you lose the Sparkle buff. And it's kind of a big deal because that means that a lot of the time your follow-up attacks just don't get the Sparkle buff. So what I've been doing in these teams is instead of running Sparkle before Sunday like you normally do in this hyper carry setup, you run Sunday first and then Sparkle in the turn order. And what this does is that it slightly delays your Ashveil's second turn, which allows the buff durations from both Sparkle and Sunday to line up a little bit longer with Ashveil. And next up is RMC, the greatest free support in gaming history, and they're great here as well. The action advance is really good, the attack frequency is really good. The fact that the true damage is one of the few buffs that Ashveil doesn't have in his kit is really good. Just everything about RMC does really well with Ashveil. And the fact that Ashveil generates energy with his passive gives Mem a little bit more charge, which gives you even more action advances. The biggest issue with RMC is that they're a highly contested unit. Like, a lot of teams want to use an RMC, and EMC is coming out soon as well, so even more contested than before. And the other thing is, you really want to run a high quality buffer in the 4th slot, which kind of limits your team options a bit with RMC. because the units that have worse buffs but better utility synergize way worse with how RMC's true damage works. Next up is Tribbie, and I have a theory. I feel like Ashveil is just all 3 Tribbies in a trench coat, and I just can't prove it. But if you actually look at their kits, they're quite similar in what they do and how they do it. Both of these characters are team-wide debuffers and follow-up attackers whose follow-up attack count resets on ultimate. And they even both have a trace that gives them a ton of damage bonus when using their follow-up attack. And they also both have a trace that gives them energy when enemies are attacked. Ashveil is just a long single target Tribbie, but I just can't prove it. And what's better on a team than 1 Tribbie, 2 Tribbies? And by that logic, they actually work really well together. Tribbie's attack frequency means that they can trigger Ashveil's follow-up attacks when they're ready, or generate a lot of energy for Ashveil. They also provide high quality unsaturated buffs, especially at E1. Tribbie is likely to be your best in slot, 4th slot option in an Ashveil team, especially with a little bit of investment. For me, my consistently fastest clearing team was Ashveil, Sunday, Tribbie and DHPT, all at E0. This team was consistent, easy to play, and is arguably Ashveil's best in slot. So I think we've covered all of the main meta / best in slot supports, but because of how Ashveil's kit works, there's actually quite a lot of interesting alternative options that can perform quite similarly to the supports I talked about in the last section. So let's talk about debuffers. Ashveil's kit provides 40% defense reduction to all enemies on the field. And the thing about defense reduction is the more that you stack it, the better it gets until you reach the cap of 100. And because Ashveil's 40% is actually quite substantial, you don't need that much more before it starts becoming quite a good stat. This makes it so there's just quite a few good nihility options for Ashveil teams, simply because you can just run a defense down light cone on a nihility character, such as Resolution Shines or Cipher's S1, and they're already providing a decent amount of value to the team. So I'm just going to cover the standout, more interesting debuffers. First of all, we have to talk about Cipher, and I can't lie, I'm going to have to put my hands up here and apologise. I was hyping up Cipher so much in the pre-release. Like, I assumed that she was going to be as good, if not better than Tribbie in Ashveil teams, and it turns out that's just not really the case. Even though the damage amp from Cipher is pretty good, there's just too many quality of life issues. Cipher's patron defaults to the enemy with the highest HP, whereas bait defaults to the enemy with the lowest HP. So what ends up happening is, even if you use Cipher's skill to make the patron the same as the bait target, once you kill the bait, they just go to separate targets. So you can't get follow-up attacks, you're getting less patron stacks overall when you're dealing damage with your Ashveil, and it just doesn't feel very good. But when it does work, it actually works really well. And even though it's a little bit janky, I do still like playing them together, but only in one specific team, which is Cipher and Sparkle together. And the reason for that is simple. You're gonna have to use Cipher's skill to change your patron target, so having unlimited skill points from Sparkle is very useful for that. Our next debuffer is probably the best in slot debuffer at this point in time, and that's Silverwolf. She has a massive amount of defense reduction, which synergizes well with Ashveil, and her multipliers are relatively high, so she actually deals a decent amount of damage in these teams. But I haven't been able to personally test it myself because I don't have Silverwolf, but it seems like it's good. And the next debuffers I want to talk about are the DOT girlies, specifically Hysilens and Black Swan. So both of them have relevant buffs for Ashveil, given vulnerability and defensive shred. So Hysilens gives 25% defensive shred and 20% vulnerability, whereas Black Swan gives 20% defensive shred and 25% vulnerability, but she also gives 72% damage bonus from her buffed traces. Honestly, these characters surprised me with how well they performed with Ashveil. Like, I spoke about it briefly in the pre-release, about how the numbers were looking good with having these characters on the team, but actually playing them was a lot better than I expected. As I stated before, they can use the nihility debuffing light cones as well, which means that you can make up for their lower defensive shred numbers through those light cone buffs. So out of these two DOT characters, who do I consider to be the best one? And it honestly depends on the scenario, because Hysilens is very, very, very consistent. So her zone provides the defensive shred automatically, and you should have her ultimate up enough to keep up her vulnerability. So her buffs are just automatically applied, and she deals a decent amount of damage on these teams. Whereas Black Swan, even though the numbers are better because of the damage bonus that she gives, it can be a bit harder to maintain all of your buff uptime, mostly because the vulnerability is only on her ultimate, which lasts for 2 turns and has a high energy cost. I also want to give an honorable mention to Pela. Pela was surprisingly good as well. I forgot that she's actually a pretty decent character. So she provides 40% defensive shred at a baseline, and you can add on the light cones as well. But the thing that actually made Pela stand out a lot was her attack frequency can be surprisingly high because of her energy mechanics, and you can use her on the Eagle set, so you can just continuously spam your skills and get a lot of ultimates, which gives Ashveil a lot more energy as well. Before we get into the next batch of characters, we have to discuss Ashveil synergy with additional damage. But what is additional damage? I'm just going to go over it quickly for those who don't know. So basically, it's an extra instance of damage from a different source than your main attack. So for example, when you attack an enemy while Robin's ultimate is active, you get an additional instance of damage or physical damage from Robin. So there's 2 main types of additional damage in this game. One that scales with the stats of your carry, and one that scales with the stats of your support. So for example, Tingyun's skill provides additional damage that scales with the stats of your carry. So if you were to use Tingyun's skill on Ashveil, it'll use Ashveil's crit damage, damage bonus, etc. to calculate the damage. Whereas there's another type of additional damage that comes from your support. So for example, Robin's additional damage uses her stats, her damage bonus, and her fixed crit rate. And because Ashveil is a greedy little guy, he synergizes with both types of additional damage. For 2 main reasons. First is his attack frequency. He attacks a lot with his follow-up attacks, so it makes it so that he can be a driver for additional damage that requires attacks, such as Robin, Tribbie, or even Tingyun. The second reason he's synergistic with this type of damage is the buffs that he provides in his kit. The defensive shred can be applied to additional damage sources like Robin's, and the crit can even improve additional damage sources like Tribbie's, DHPT's, or his own. So this strong synergy with additional damage means that certain characters that have additional damage in their kit perform slightly better with Ashveil than expected. The first additional damage dealer that I want to talk about is Robin. In the pre-release, I was a little bit down on Robin because she herself doesn't attack, and some of the buffs that she provides are already quite saturated, like damage bonus and crit. But in practice, she's a little bit better than expected, and this is mostly down to her additional damage. If you build her properly for damage dealing, she can actually deal quite a lot of damage in Ashveil teams, just because the defensive shred is one of the few buffs that actually increases her damage. And her buffs at E1 are actually quite good as well. And minor leaks, but it's rumoured that she's coming to the gift shop soon, so getting that E1 might actually make Robin one of the better supports that you can use with Ashveil. But Robin still has her normal issues. Her energy issues are still quite bad with Ashveil, even with his high frequency attacking. And the fact that she doesn't attack is a huge deal in this team. If you want to play Robin with Ashveil, I would recommend a team that has a frequent attacker inside it as well. One of my favourites was with March 7th actually, just because I built Robin more DPS style, so they were both driving her damage. So next up is Tingyun. Tingyun is actually really good with Ashveil, and I feel like she's slowly making her way back into the meta without anyone noticing, but she's good. The additional damage that she provides has huge value on Ashveil teams. The energy is massive. It really helps him feel smooth. Like, she provides so much energy that sometimes it can feel like too much energy because you can't trigger his follow-up attacks quick enough. The fact that she can attack is also massive, and the attack percentage buffs go a long way with Ashveil because of his high base attack, but I'm going to get into that later. She also provides some minor utility from her eidolons, such as extra energy when you get a kill, and the conditional speed bonus. The main issue with Tingyun is her buff uptime. The damage bonus that she gives from her ult only lasts for 2 turns, which can get eaten up really quickly. And the fact that you have to use her skill to reapply your buff means that you're attacking less, which is a downside. My personal favourite team with Tingyun was with Tribbie, because Tribbie's attack frequency allows you to keep up with the higher charge generation that you get from ulting on Ashveil more frequently thanks to Tingyun's energy. The last additional damage dealer that I want to talk about is DHPT. So some people might not know, but DHPT on his Enhanced Soul Dragon from the ultimate has additional damage that scales with Ashveil stats. And this is one of the main reasons why DHPT is so strong with Ashveil. And he's by far the best sustain for Ashveil because of this additional damage. If you look up really fast clears of Anomaly Arbitration with Ashveil, you'll normally see an E2 DHPT. And this is because the additional damage that you get from that E2 is massive for Ashveil in comparison to other characters, especially since Ashveil gives DHPT so much energy and the Soul Dragon a lot of action advance because of his high attack frequency. Okay, so the last support that I want to talk about is one that I've heard absolutely nothing about, and I'm quite excited to say that Hanya is surprisingly good with Ashveil. And I only really tested her just for fun. I picked up my Hanya with half-level traces, put her in an Ashveil team, and I was honestly shocked with how well it was doing. So I went back and had a look at some of her numbers, and then it started to make a lot of sense. And the easiest way for me to show this to you guys is to compare her to Robin. Ashveil has the highest base attack in the game if you consider him at S1. And Hanya actually provides a sizable amount of attack percent buffs in her kit. Her ult basically gives 64 attack percent and another 10% from her Ascension passive. With Ashveil's around 1400 base attack, Hanya's attack buffs give Ashveil basically 1000 attack. And she also gives a speed buff with her ultimate, which allows you to comfortably run attack boots on your Ashveil, which will give you another 609 attack. We can compare this to Robin, who gives around 990 to 1100 attack from her ultimate, which is very similar to Hanya's buffs. At E6, Hanya also gives 43% damage bonus, which is very similar to Robin's 50% damage bonus. Hanya can also run the Sacrados set, which also gives her similar but less powerful crit damage buffs to Robin. So in terms of pure buffing capabilities, Hanya is actually very similar to Robin, and in some aspects, like just purely attack buffing, Hanya can provide even a little bit more attack because you can consider attack boots. And another massive thing about Hanya is that she can attack every single one of her turns. She can attack, and she's going to be built very fast anyways to maximize her speed buff. And her E1 also advances her when Ashveil kills an enemy, which is bound to happen because you're playing Ashveil, giving Hanya even more turns, which ends up making her the Harmony unit with the second highest attack frequency behind Tribbie. My favourite Hanya team was with Tribbie because when you run Hanya with an action advancer and Ashveil, you might end up using up her ult buff really quickly. But with Tribbie, her ult buff actually lasts long enough with her E4 that you can keep almost 100% uptime. So I think we've covered all of the notable supports for a main DPS Ashveil team. Now it's time to talk sustains. So your best sustain, without a doubt, no question, is DHPT. He just provides so much for Ashveil. Ashveil is a character who likes attack, he gives attack. He likes additional damage, he gives additional damage. He also has really high attack frequency and can keep your Ashveil alive. A lot of other sustains really struggle with keeping Ashveil alive. In the pre-release, I spoke briefly about how Aventurine could be a decent option, but in practice is a little bit less good than I expected, mostly because Aventurine sustain is kind of lacking in this current meta, so you end up having to use your skill quite a lot. And the only offensive buff that he provides in his kit is 15% crit damage vulnerability, but Ashveil already gets so much crit damage, so is even less of a buff. So Aventurine is good if you have no other options, but DHPT is just the one. I also tried him with some abundance units such as Lingsha and Gallagher, but they just struggled to keep him alive. Out of the 2 abundance units that I tried, My favourite was Lingsha, mostly because of her high attack frequency and the fact that she's able to use Shared Feeling, which gives Ashveil more energy when she uses her skill, and because her skill is an attack, it gives Ashveil more energy. So when Lingsha skills, instead of just getting 8 energy, you would get 12. Okay, so we're going to briefly cover Sustainless main DPS Ashveil, and I can't lie, Sustainless is just a bit rough. Not only because of his low base stats, but because there isn't really any good 4th slot unit that will help him to reach those breakpoints that you need for Sustainless to be successful. Like, so for example, you can run a Tribbie and a Sunday, but who's going to be in your 4th slot? And currently the default is DHPT, but there isn't really any other character that provides more synergy in terms of like frequent attacking, attack buffs, blah blah blah, than DHPT. For example, if you slot in another damage buffer like Sparkle, you're not going to have the frequent attacks to get your ultimate. And if you slot in a frequent attacker like March 7th or Motsa, then the buffs will be a bit lackluster and you won't be able to hit those breakpoints for Sustainless. There is probably someone out there who has high enough investment on all their supports and everything that they can do a Sustainless run, but for the average player or any player with lower levels of investment like me who's free to play, there just isn't the right pieces to do a Sustainless run. But Mr. Welt Yang is getting a buff, and from the leaks is looking like he could easily be the saviour of Sustainless Ashveil. The action value delay synergizes well with Ashveil's frequent attacks, and the debuffs that he provides, Defensive Shred and at E6 Res Pen, really work well with Ashveil. So that might be the strong buffer and survivability option that is the final piece in an Ashveil Sustainless team. So in summary, if you want to build a strong Ashveil main DPS team, you can either just play some of the strong meta supports like Sunday, Sparkle, RMC and Tribbie, or you can make a team where you add one of those meta supports and one more off meta support like Tingyun, Hanya, or even Black Swan. And then DHPT is locked in as the sustain slot. So let's finally move on to his sub DPS playstyle. And by sub DPS, I mean a playstyle where the damage is more mixed between the carry and Ashveil. There's only really 3 sub DPS teams that I want to talk about, and surprisingly none of them are follow-up, just because I don't have Fei Xiao, Yun Li, the notable follow-up characters. But the 3 characters I want to talk about is Acheron, Boothill and Evernight. You might have already seen some of the clips of Ashveil generating ultimate stacks for Acheron very quickly by using Topaz's signature light cone. But that's not the only way that you can do that. You don't necessarily need to pull this light cone for you to do this kind of playstyle. So there's 3 main ways that I can think of that you can do this. So there's E2 Silver Wolf, which applies a debuff whenever you attack, which will also apply to Ashveil's follow-up attacks. You can also use Fugue, who allows her skill target to apply debuffs. So you can use her skill on Ashveil and he will apply debuffs in the same way. But the issue with these options is that E2 Silver Wolf is expensive and Fugue doesn't apply enough buffs for the team. So I would recommend what I've been doing, which is using Hysilens, because her talent allows Ashveil to apply a DOT on every single follow-up attack, which also provides Acheron with stacks of Slash Stream. And because she already provides Defensive Shred in her kit, it actually synergizes quite well with Ashveil. So if you don't have Topaz's signature light cone, this is actually a pretty decent option. Especially if you use a defense shred and light cone on Hysilens, which allows you to get closer to 100% defense reduction. So next up is Boothill, and you guys know that I'm the Boothill guy. Like, when I first saw Ashveil's design, I knew I was going to play him with Boothill together, no matter what. And it's actually a good team. It's not as good as Boothill's best in slot team with Dahlia, Fugue, Ruame / HMC, but it's still quite a competitive team, especially in pure fiction. In pure fiction, this team is one of Boothill's best, if not his best team, because Ashveil is able to deal with the mob so easily. So there's only really 2 teams with Ashveil and Boothill together that I'd actually consider good. And both of them are sustainless. So the first one is Boothill, Dahlia, Ruame and Ashveil. I actually like this team because Ruame buffs both Ashveil and Boothill's damage quite considerably, and with her E1 and Dahlia's defensive shred plus a defensive shred light cone, you can actually reach 100% defensive shred on this team. And with Real May's other buffs, you can just build Ashveil as you normally would build him on the main DPS team, and he'll deal a lot of damage in this team. The other team is Boothill, Dahlia, Fugue and Ashveil. This team is considerably worse for Ashveil's personal damage, but because Fugue gives Ashveil access to the super break damage multiplier, you can build him as a breaker instead. And even though it deals less damage because he doesn't deal that much toughness damage, building Ashveil as a breaker means that you can use defensive stats like HP and defense on his orb and his chest and still have him contribute to the team. Because it's sustainless, you'll often find that this will be the easier team to run, just so that Ashveil isn't constantly dying and you have to constantly reset. Overall, Ashveil is a decent teammate for Boothill, but I wouldn't go out of my way to pull him for Boothill because it's a lot more situational and a lot more niche. And the last DPS that I want to talk about is actually Evernight, which some of you might be a little bit surprised by, but it made sense in my head, mostly because I think what Evernight struggles with most as a DPS is single target damage. Her AoE damage is insanely good, but it can be hard to consolidate that damage. For example, when there's situations where there's only one boss left on the field. And Ashveil can help you out by focusing on those single targets, which can cover up Evernight's biggest weaknesses when you're not running her with Casterus. So we're finally onto his last playstyle, which is his supportive playstyle. And I'm gonna have to say, it's literally my favorite Ashveil playstyle. There's so many interesting creative teams that you can come up with, but it's a little bit unfortunate because it's kind of locked behind his E1 or his S1, because without them, his supportive capabilities are a little bit lacking. But if you manage to even pick up one of these things, he becomes a competitive support, like competitive with E0 Tribbie. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, Ashveil is literally just 3 Tribbies in a trench coat, with a little bit less supportive capability, but he deals considerably more damage. And because there's so many potential teams, I'm just going to talk about my 3 favourite archetypes where I felt like he was a really good support. The first team I want to talk about is the Ashveil team with Archer, Sparkle, Ashveil and DHPT. And honestly, this team is very, very good. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's because Archer is currently the DPS that Ashveil synergizes the best with in the whole game. And it's mostly because of how frequently Archer can attack, which just charges up Ashveil's energy by a lot. And the additional damage that you get from Ashveil really helps you to reach those breakpoints and actually kill enemies without wasting your skills on them. My only concern with this team is that even though Ashveil synergizes really well with Archer, Archer has a lot of options for that slot and they all perform quite similarly. Like you could use Cipher, Silver Wolf, Yao Guang. So it isn't necessarily worth it to pull Ashveil just for this option if you already have the good alternatives. But if I'm being honest, this is probably going to be my most played Ashveil team going forward. It just felt really good, and it doesn't have a lot of the quality of life issues that some of Ashveil's other teams can have. So next up, I want to talk about DOT, and it's a bit difficult to talk about because I've really been enjoying playing Ashveil with the DOT girlies. But when it comes to this archetype, the 3-unit core of Hysilens, Kafka and Black Swan is so strong together that replacing any of them with another option causes the team to decrease in performance. There is the option of running a Sustainless team with Ashveil as the 4th slot, and this team is actually kind of nutty. Like, I think is my favourite, if not the best, Sustainless DOT team, mostly because Ashveil can trigger Kafka's follow-ups very frequently, and Kafka can give Ashveil a lot of energy as well. And one of the main problems with DOT and Sustainless is the lack of front-loaded damage, which can make it hard to kill enemies before they attack you and kill you. But with Ashveil, you can actually front-load a lot of damage through his follow-up attacks and his ultimate, whilst considerably buffing the team because you can reach 100% defensive shred. In this team, Black Swan's Arcana already ignores 20% defense, so you'll be overcapping. So you can run Black Swan on the win set instead and give her additional turns. But obviously, Sustainless is very dangerous, very risky, a lot of people don't like playing it. So there are other options for DOT teams, and I'm a free-to-play player, so I understand that not everyone has access to all the best in slot characters for a team. And I think if you're missing Hysilens, you're missing a Black Swan, and to a lesser extent, if you're missing Kafka, Ashveil is likely to be your best in slot replacement. So if you have Black Swan and Kafka and you don't have Hysilens, you could put Ashveil on that team, and that's likely to be your best performing DOT team. The reason why I personally love Ashveil in these DOT teams is the buffs are actually really relevant. So he ends up dealing a good amount of personal damage on these teams. And if you have Black Swan's E1, she might actually be the best support for just purely damage boosting purposes for Ashveil. And there's one more team with Ashveil as a support that's really janky, but I kind of want you guys to try it, so I'm going to mention it here. And it's using Sustain as a DPS. So you might have seen something like this before with DPS Lingsha, but essentially you can run a Sustain with Dahlia, Ruan Mei, and now Ashveil to create actually a really strong team. Like, I tried with DHPT and with Lingsha, and I just did it for fun. But when I started seeing the numbers and how well it's actually clearing, I realized that these could be decent teams. So the idea is you build your Sustain as a hybrid break crit DPS and put the dance partner effect on your Sustain. And this actually allows them to deal a good amount of AoE damage, especially DHPT, since his enhanced Soul Dragon damage scales off Ashveil stats. So you can build DHPT as a full breaker and still deal a lot of damage in this team. If you've played a team with DPS Lingsha in the past, you might already know that her biggest weakness is her single target damage, because one of her main features is her AoE break. But with Ashveil, you can consolidate that single target and actually have a fully functioning team. I really want you guys to try out these teams, and please leave a comment down below of how it went for you, if you enjoyed it, because I think I'm onto something. These will be pretty good for a while, I think. Ashveil's biggest strength as a support, in my opinion, is when you're running him in a crit hybrid team. So if it's like hybrid break crit, or maybe even DOT crit, or even elation crit, he will be one of the best options. Let's talk about Ashveil's pull value. I know that the general community sentiment is that Ashveil has low pull value, but I think that his pull value is a lot higher than what people are saying. Obviously, he's not a must pull, but he is being judged quite heavily on his performance as a main DPS. But Ashveil isn't just a main DPS. He's a main DPS, a sub DPS, and a support. And he's literally the first character of his type in the game. We have Anaxa who comes close, but he's not a good generic support outside of his erudition teams, where Ashveil is. And I think it's really interesting because it's the same school of design as some of the best characters in another Hoyo game, Genshin Impact, where characters like Mawika and Columbina have all three playstyles. And this is specifically really good for people who don't have many units on their account, because you have a unit that can fulfill multiple roles, and you have multiple pathways for building a good team for Ashveil. To me, Ashveil is the potential man of HSR. There's just too much stuff going on in his kit for him not to be useful on your account somewhere. And all of his teams have room to grow with better teammates and better synergies. I feel like Ashveil is going to be one of those characters, a bit like Tribbie when they were first released, or even Cipher to some extent, where people consider them a slight upgrade or a side grade to current options. But in like 2 months, 3 months, you're just going to see tons of showcases that have Ashveil in it. And we've already seen footage of him synergizing quite well with Evernight and E6 Welt in 4.2. I also feel like he is a sleeper pick for Elation, because the aha instant that you get gives him a ton of energy, since you get 8 energy from each Elation skill that hits an enemy. And because Elation scales off of very limited stats, and we might get an Elation sustain, Ashveil might end up being one of the better options in an Elation team as well. But for the average player that just wants to clear Anomaly Arbitration right here, right now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend him unless you have some of the high investment pieces already in place. We have literally no idea what his best in slot team actually looks like in the future. So even if you pull him and then you pull an E1 Tribbie for him, there's a fairly high chance that she just gets kicked out of his team. So if you like Ashveil, don't be afraid to pull him. I know that supports tend to rerun quite quickly, but this isn't really the case for male supports and male sub DPS. Like if you look at how long it took for Sunday to rerun compared to Tribbie, you start to see a pattern. And if you like him and you have the resources, you might as well pull him now. But you don't need to go out of your way to like top up or anything to get him. You can just wait. But if you like him, you have the gems, and you're just feeling a bit reluctant, I'd say just go for it. Well, I think I've covered all the information that I wanted to cover. I know this video was a bit more informative and a bit yappier than usual, but there was a lot of information to get through, and I hope that you either learned something or just had a decent time hearing me talk about Ashveil for a little bit. Subscribe if you want to. Have a good day, detectives, and bye.